This movie sexualizes cupcakes. You probably won't understand, except I've got 2 of them in this box, so I guess I kind of sexualize my cupcakes myself, except that, especially considering there's cream coming out of one of them. This went to a really weird place very quickly. Anyway, I saw a movie called What If, starring Daniel Radcliffe and some girl who I did not know who she was before this, but I described on the phone immediately afterwards as being very cute. So this movie is very twee. This movie is what would happen if Urban Outfitters grew a script. I think it's like just so twee, so very, very twee. But I have a very high tolerance for twee, so I thought this movie was very cute. It had some obvious flaws with a lot of the scripting that. Okay, I'm going to backtrack to the history, because if I know anything about the history, I like to talk about it. This movie was originally titled The F Word. It was screened in the Toronto International Film Festival, which makes an awful lot of sense considering that the movie was shot in Toronto. In that respect alone, it earned a very fond place in my heart of movies that are in Toronto, especially movies that are in Toronto that have this kind of indie tone. It has now joined the club with Scott Pilgrim, which is pretty much the only other movie that fits that bill I can think of. But Scott Pilgrim is good company to be in as far as I'm concerned. That if I'm comparing the two, movies that are about romance with a couple that has some sort of ex problem in Toronto that have this kind of slacker vibe, this is not the superior of the two. Not being a very important word in that sentence, but still, it was passable. In a world of romantic comedies that are really hard to tolerate, finding one that has an original voice is hard, and I maybe don't want to say this is completely original. There are some moments which are very clearly indie. They have the female character is an animator, so they have scenes of her animation, and it looks like the kind of stuff that is very clearly offbeat. Like, I would not have been surprised to see this flying around in, say, a Juno, which just seems to cater very specifically to this one market of countercultural 20-somethings, and that is completely where this movie is headed. That's just the tone that it has and the audience that it wants to attract. That, in spite of myself, I do tend to like this kind of movie, but it's a very stylized for the entire film. It's got a soundtrack that I would not be surprised to have been hearing if I was walking by a store like Urban Outfitters. I'm just going to keep coming back to that. It's like they could have had a corporate tie-in with the outfits, that and Anthropology, and maybe ModCloth. That's the kind of... Why do I even know what these companies are? Yeah. So this movie is a little harder to talk about in terms of the dialogue because it is very stylized. That every single character talks like the movie talks. They don't necessarily talk like how a person would be expected to talk. They have a lot of wordplay that's very clever and it's nice to hear. But at the same time, the characters themselves don't seem to have that many discerning characteristics in terms of what they're saying. That they all have the same sense of wit. And it makes the movie charming in some ways, but then in another, it's to the detriment of the characters as independent entities, because the only difference in their speech, not in their actions, there are distinct characters in their actions, but when they're talking, the only way that you would really tell who is saying a line is who is physically saying that line. The male and female lead have a very similar sense of humor, and that's part of the charm of the movie. That's part of the point it's trying to make, but at the same time, it could be an unsettling point. That they're so similar that it's the opposite of opposites attract. These are two people who are extremely similar, and it's their similarities that draw them together, but at the same time, it makes that very difficult to relay in speech. So it feels more like it was the result of one person idealizing what if there was someone who thought exactly like me in the world, and we talked to each other, and that's what the conversation is. It's one mind discussing and bouncing off, and there are points in the movie where that's part of the plot, but because that's part of the plot, it makes it very difficult to discern what the characters are, and it gives the whole movie this distinct voice. I'm going to bring it back to Juno again, saying it's a problem, but also a strength of a movie like that. But whereas Juno was so stylized that it seemed to exist in its own universe, this one never quite crosses that line into being the fantasy land. It's just close enough to reality where it ends up feeling a little bit off. When I walked out of the theater, I overheard someone else behind me who was saying that they thought that that was unrealistic, how they're just bantering back and forth, and I do feel like there are people who can do that, but it was so similar that their thought process was so aligned that when you're meshing it, that it didn't quite coalesce. It never hit that point where it completely blended, and that it was close. It was close enough that it was rarely a distraction, that it's only in retrospect when it really stands out to me. Another issue that could be brought up with the movie, depending on your perspective, is the primary point it needs to tackle, and this is where the movie could have some strength in a way, because it's on somewhat treaded ground at first. The premise is, these two are friends, and that's why the original title, the F word, was friend or friend zone, because it's very clear up front. She's pounding him, friends, and he's doesn't want to be friends, so it's not quite in the territory of something that would be in a higher caliber like When Harry Met Sally, but it's close enough that it's not completely original ground, and it's the script and the way that it's staged that gives the movie its voice rather than the topic matter. But the way that the main couple gets together, because she is currently in a relationship when they meet, that ends up becoming a lot of the conflict. That I don't want to be too specific about the conclusion that some people who came, but okay, partial spoiler that the two of them get together at the end. I know, romantic comedy where the two people get together, that is so shocking. Like, that never happens except in 500 Days of Summer, and my sarcastic voice is not very distinguishable from my normal voice, other than it dipping into a monotone that would put someone to sleep, so please get that with. Okay. Rather than me going on about that, let's try to talk about the movie. Yes, that was it. That, could you trust somebody if this happened to you? If you met the right person and then you were, but they were involved with someone else and they ended up going over to you in the end, would you ever be able to actually trust them because they've cheated on their other? And there were people who had a problem with that, and I think a lot of that's going to come down to personal preference and perspective based on your life experiences, if you think that can be a problem which can be overcome or not. And that's going to be very divisive coming out of this movie if people think that it's possible or not. And me, I'm kind of on a middle ground due to my own experiences that I'm going to be vague about because they're not specifically related to me, they're related to people around me, and since things float around on the internet, that is not the best plan. But the bottom line is that I believe that these two people would think that it's okay at that point. That my final thought was that they showed The Princess Bride in this movie. They go to a late night showing of The Princess Bride and they talk about going to movies on your own. Yeah, I saw this movie on my own. I approve of the main character, Wallace. Oh yeah, his name is Wallace, and I'm drawing Scott Pilgrim mentions in my head. But, so, really made me want to go watch The Princess Bride again. Tried to do its whole romantic debate on how you can't not be a romantic and watch The Princess Bride on your own, and no, I think you can. Princess Bride's funny enough. It's mainly a comedy, and it's got romance on the side, and this is the inverse. It's mainly a romance analyzing relationships, and the comedy is just lightly sprinkled throughout the movie through the characters' dialogue, which the humor in this movie is very bitter. It's very based on wit, not so. There are very few instances of situational humor. It's all the characters trying to be clever to each other and making references to various pop culture, or just generally being super sarcastic. This is a movie for someone who loves when watching other people be sarcastic. Cutting remarks all over the place. It could be a champion vegetable peeler with all of the cutting remarks that they make. Also, fridge magnets with poetry on them, which you can probably buy at an Urban Outfitters. Yeah, this movie has a very specific demographic that could, if properly reached out to, love the shit out of this movie. But for a casual movie-going audience, the non-20-something, so say, like, 30 and over, unless you're really artistic or you specifically like this kind of independent romance movie, I'm going to go and say if you wanted a hybrid between 500 Days of Summer and Juno that's a little more low-key than Juno, but more less cynical than 500 Days of Summer, then this movie kind of falls in that line. For performances, I really liked, my little article I have up here says Zoe Kazan, or Kazan, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her last name, but she was adorable. I really liked her. I kind of wonder if they had to reach far and wide to find an actress to be opposite Radcliffe because they were afraid to have a female lead who was taller than him, but even if that was the case, I really liked her. That Daniel Radcliffe does a solid job, and like many people, that I feel like he's been making some very interesting choices in his career, and interesting in a good way. I'm curious to see another movie that got a screening in Toronto, Horns, which I did not get to see that one when I was in Toronto either. So I respect what he's trying to do. That I got to see him perform live and in a play, and I have to say that he's very solid as a theater actor, but I actually like him more in a role like this on film. It read very non-Harry Potter, so he can read that way on film, and perhaps it was just the experience of seeing the play, because the situation, the setting was not ideal, not that the theater wasn't beautiful, but that might be why I didn't take from it quite the same as seeing him perform in this, but I thought that he did a good job. But I think he might have gotten outshined a little bit by Zoe Kazan, and the other people who were in the film, the side characters, the friends, may have been a little too over the top. That I, again, found that the couple spoke differently than the main characters by a little bit, but they both spoke like they were the same person, and that says some interesting things about relationships, that perhaps that this movie thinks that you're drawn to somebody who thinks exactly like you do, and while in some ways that might be accurate, in others that could be insanely creepy. So if you find someone else who keeps on making these so pauses and refuses to edit their videos, I guess, no, don't send them my way. I do not need that in my life. But yeah, so I have my Pretty Starry Night shirt on to match my Starry Night poster in the back, because this is, though I am going to go back and review a couple of other movies that I've seen, and if I end up with a free 2 hours, there's a possibility I could end up at the 100-foot journey, but I'm probably not going to go more than 5 feet in order to find it. Final thought was, with the rename of this one, having spent the summer in New York, What If and If Then should have had a crossover called What If Then, and it could be a word association game. It's like the Would You Rather game, except specific to New York City. I'm really going to miss being here and seeing all these movies, but I will be doing a much more articulate and far more in advance set of these reviews when I get to go back to TIFF. So that'll be Probably reading off of a notebook because I will have to take notes in the theater. Maybe someone will think I'm actually a critic when I bring my notes. That happened last year. I took notes in the theater and someone's like, "Are you for a paper?" I'm like, no, I'm just doing this online. So yeah, another movie from TIFF. TIFF has a good selection process. Yeah, I really stressed this out. Thank you for listening to me rambling, if you see this at all, anybody out there in the world, ever. Please don't mention cupcakes and sex in the same sentence. I like my cupcakes to be abstinent. Thank you. Bye.